maybe.
Yes, I think so. I can see it.
Yes, okay, fantastic. Let me start my timer here, get stay on track. All right, so today I'll be talking briefly about volunteer stewardship in riparian areas. The Winooski Natural Resources Conservation District has run into a similar challenge, as with many groups around the state, in figuring out how we can provide stewardship to the areas where we plant trees after the fact. We have a few grants that provide some support, financial support for staff to be able to go back and provide stewardship to some of the plantings. But for the most part, we have really struggled to be able to find the funding to go back and give these areas the TLC that they need. So a couple of years ago, we sort of tiptoed into figuring out whether we might be able to train volunteers to help us do some of these stewardship activities. And we've had some success. So I'd like to share a little bit about our experience coordinating that program, share some of the resources and training materials that we've created. And I'd be really eager to hear from all of you if people are running similar programs and sort of what opportunities and challenges you have found. So if you don't know about us, the Winooski Conservation District is one of 14 conservation districts in Vermont. We promote the wise use, sustainable development, and conservation of our district's natural resources. We serve this little teal sliver here, so Chittenden and Washington counties. And one of our many programs is the Trees for Streams program, through which we usually plant between 1,000 and 2,000 trees along riparian areas each year. So this is sort of the map of sites that we have built up, I believe, over the past 5 years of planting. And this is the map that I use when a volunteer contacts me from a scout troop or just a family who's interested or an individual who wants to do something to help out. I ask where they're located, and then I take a look at this map, which I have color coded for myself. Blue dots are private property, which I have not worked on sending volunteers to yet, though there may be some homeowners or landowners that might be willing to coordinate that effort. Orange is sites that are public and that are open for adoption, so to speak, and green are sites so far that have been adopted. So I'm a very visual person, and so doing it in this sort of map form has really helped me conceptualize where we are able to send people. And then these purple dots are sites where we actually have funding for staff to go back and do stewardship in maybe a more detail-oriented way. So this is the map that I start with. We've done a little bit of targeted recruitment for volunteers in areas where there are sites that need to be adopted. But we also have sort of let the program naturally evolve, where, again, people reach out from community volunteer groups or individuals who are interested. And this can just be a nice volunteer opportunity because people can sign up anytime throughout the year. And we've provided training materials that are entirely online based. And so they don't need to show up at a certain date or a certain time to learn how they can help positively contribute to their watershed in this way. I'll show you the waivers that we use, the training materials, and talk a little bit about follow-up and communication. So who can volunteer? The great thing is that everyone from old to young and anyone that is in a group or a single person or who wants to volunteer as a family can do this. These are some photos from a really great event that happened a couple of years ago in Williston, where Sustainable Williston and the Conservation Commission came together and rallied a few volunteers to survey about 400 trees along Allen Brook. And they helped to monitor for survival. They also helped, as you can see down here, to weed in sort of 1 foot areas around the base of each tree, to gently remove bindweed, and just do a lot of things to give this site a little bit of TLC and help hopefully give it that extra chance at survival. So when we recruit groups, sometimes I will go and be part of sort of an early morning training and then let them do their own thing. Or sometimes I can just provide them with the materials and they can figure out how they would like to sort of divide and conquer the tasks. But I encourage a few different people to take on specialized tasks if there's a group so that it's not total chaos. So like I said, one person sort of removes the bindweed or does those really sort of detail-oriented tasks. Maybe a few people are weeding and pulling out competition in a 1 square foot base of the tree. A few people have trash bags and are going around to do some site cleanup, whether some of the tubes have fallen off or the trees are ready for those tubes to be gone, or they're just finding general trash, especially if it's a public walking trail. And then 1 or 2 people are walking around with a clipboard doing the survival inventory, so identifying the trees to the best of their ability and also making any notes about if trees have died, if they can tell why. So I'm happy to share this. I know for a 10-minute presentation, I can't go through all the details, but this is what I give volunteer individuals or groups when they sign up. So we match them with the site that makes sense. I let them know what to bring, so things like garden gloves, sturdy work boots, make sure you're bringing your maps and garbage bags. I give them a little bit of homework. I'll show you how I format the site map in a way that is approachable for someone who has maybe never been to the site before. I ask them to do a little bit of research about the tree species that are specific to their planting plan down here. And I also share about some of the hazards that they might encounter at their site so that they'll be prepared. So this is sort of the list, sorry, this keeps popping up, of the different species of trees that were originally planted here. And some clues for identification are whether the trees are in tubes or not. And up here, I share sort of the best way to go through the tree inventory, reminding people that they'll probably miss a few trees here and there, and that's okay. My goal with sending volunteers out is just to recognize trends. Are we seeing a lot of damage from beavers at this site, or are we seeing more invasive pressure? So I ask them to tally the number alive, the number damaged or dead, and make any notes that they can about those species. I share that they need to do a little bit of site maintenance with regards to trash and weeding, and then request that they send a few photos to me and also fill out a time tracking sheet so that we can sort of gauge the impact of the program. So these are some links that might be useful if you're putting together a similar sort of remote training. Since I'm not there to actively point out how to identify poison ivy or wild parsnip or talk about ticks, these are 3 really great links that I send people to. And then I want people to clearly know where they're going and what's expected of them, because there's nothing worse than pulling up to a parking lot, looking around and saying, I'm not sure quite where I need to go. So I make a Google map in a Google extension called My Maps. And this actually allows the volunteers to open this on their cell phone while they're in the field, so they can see where their little blue dot is that says where they are and whether they are actually in the right spot relative to these boxes that I've made. So for this Williston site, we've got parking here. You walk around the baseball field, and then there are 2 sites that are pretty clearly defined about where they need to go. I've found that it takes a lot more time to put together a volunteer-friendly site map, but it really is worth the effort since you're not there necessarily to facilitate that volunteer experience. This is a copy of our waiver. Again, I'm happy to share. I make sure that everyone fills out a waiver before they start. And for these programs, for like sort of the annual adopting of a site, I have them just put the date as the full year of 2021. And of course, I want to know how many times people are going to visit their site and what type of impact they're having. So I made a really quick Google form, and I just have them put their name, their site, how many hours they spent, and what types of activities they completed. I ask them to visit their site between 3 and 6 times a year, and only one of those times do they need to submit the survival sheet with the summary of species and how they're doing. So I want to know what's happening in those in-between times. So something that's great about this is that these volunteers are sort of building investment in our organization. We try to offer a thank you, either t-shirts or stickers, and then we encourage them to join our newsletter to learn about other volunteer opportunities and to share the experience with their friends and neighbors. So it's been a really great sort of first step for people that are looking for something to do on their own timeline. All right, now I'm getting close to the end of my time here. I've got a couple slides left. The benefits of this program for us have been, like I said, people can sign up anytime throughout the year, get trained, and then start to visit their site. Volunteers can create their own schedule instead of needing to be available for the 3 or 4 days that you might have a tree planting project. And we just have more eyes on the trees that we've planted. So we're really happy and excited about that. Of course, some limitations are that not all our volunteers are tree ID experts. So we get ballpark data, we recognize trends, but we don't necessarily get data that's accurate enough for reporting. So for those sites where we are getting paid to be able to go out and do a proper species by species inventory and survey, we send staff out for that. And like I said, we've also limited this program just to plantings on public land. So I'm interested to see if some private landowners might be willing to do sort of 1 or 2 visits from volunteer stewards throughout the year. So I'm happy to answer any questions and would really love to hear if other people are running similar programs to this. So this is my contact info. You're welcome to reach out. And if I have 5 seconds for a shameless plug, the Winooski Conservation District is running our annual tree sale, which is a fundraiser for other programs. We are selling these rad put a tree on it magnets. So if you're interested, check out our website. You're a bunch of tree planting nerds, so thought you might be interested in that offering.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen. So we definitely do have time for questions. If folks want to drop questions in the chat, we can do it that way. Or if you want to raise your hand and ask a question with your voice, you could do that too. And Kristen, I don't know if you saw this, but Peter Danforth said that he'd love to see the template for the training sheet, and I'm sure that other folks would too. So if you want to send that to me, I'm happy to send that out to folks, or if you have a link or whatever works.
Sure, I'll send it to you.
Great. All right, well, I don't see any questions. Oh, here we go. Map of sites. Is the map of sites also in My Maps?
Yes. Yeah, I like that it's sort of a simple, you can color code, you can put information internally, but it's a little bit easier than using GIS.
Awesome. Okay, well, with that, I think we'll move on to the next presentation. So here we go. So next up, we have Jess Colby with the Northwood Stewardship Center talking about a letter writing campaign to landowners in the Memphremagog Basin. And Jess, go ahead.
Alrighty, let's see if that works. You see my screen all right?
Yep, we can see it.
All right, perfect. Okay, so I'm here to talk about engaging landowners in riparian conservation, specifically through outreach letters. So we'll start right in. So just a little bit of background on me. My name is Jessica Colby, and I am the Riparian Projects and Forestry Outreach Coordinator for Northwood Stewardship Center. I graduated from the University of Vermont in 2017 with a bachelor's in wildlife and fisheries biology and a minor in forestry. I've worked with many of Northwood's partner organizations here in the Northeast Kingdom, with most of my work focusing on riparian restoration in eastern brook trout habitat in northern Vermont and New Hampshire. So the group that I'm a part of is called the Memphremagog Basin Riparian Partnership, and it's a collaboration among natural resources professionals from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Vermont Fish and Wildlife, Pete Emerson, who you heard from yesterday, he's one of our primary partners on the project, Northwood's Orleans County Natural Resources Conservation District, and the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. So our goal is to connect private landowners with conservation organizations to hopefully conduct projects near rivers and streams in the Memphremagog Basin to better protect and restore riparian lands for wildlife habitat and water quality. So what are Vermont riparian lands? During the 1960s, the state bought through a variety of funding sources parcels located along streams and rivers with the purpose of retaining these lands for angler access to water bodies into the future. Many of these parcels are only narrow strips of land measuring only a rod length, which is about 16.5 feet in width. And many of these are considered floating rods, so they move with the river. If the bank erodes, you maintain that 16.5 foot area regardless. So unlike other property boundaries, which would lose that area, the floating rod keeps it. So the state owns over 100 miles of stream bank areas throughout Vermont, and of the 65 miles are located within District 5, which is primarily in the Northeast Kingdom. So the state owns these lands in addition to wildlife management areas and conservation easements, and has a vested interest in protecting that habitat for water quality and wildlife, providing access to the public and implementing good conservation practices. So we're all pretty familiar with many of these practices, but I just wanted to quickly run through some of the conservation practices that we focus on with our communications with landowners. So this primarily includes stream bank buffer improvements, so tree planting, filter strip, revegetating buffers, no-mow, habitat improvement practices such as invasive species monitoring and removal, and strategic wood additions, and then bank stabilization practices such as vegetated geogrids. So where does the funding come from? Some of the common funding sources for many of these practices include the USDA, NRCS, Vermont Clean Water Initiative, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and many, many other sources from other state programs, private organizations, and national foundations. And it's thanks to efforts by Senator Patrick Leahy that Lake Champlain was added to the list of Great Lakes in 1998, which opened up a bunch of funding for projects within the Champlain Valley, and as Pete mentioned yesterday, now includes Lake Mount for Magog. So my position has been funded partly through this source and has allowed the Memphremagog Basin Partnership to begin outreach to landowners within the basin. So in 2019, state-owned riparian lands in District 5 were assessed by a private contractor to conduct landscape level assessments of the properties to identify issues and to prioritize potential project areas. So the Memphremagog Partnership aims to build upon this work by zooming in on the adjacent landowners to expand conservation efforts within each of the basin's subwatersheds. So the goals of the partnership will be met by identifying potential landowner partners relative to these project areas, mapping properties in relation to state-owned lands, planning objectives for each of the proposed projects, which is like tree planting, invasive control, bank stabilization, acquisition, easements, all of that fun stuff. And then identifying and involving each of the relevant agencies and organizations. We really wanted to focus on building upon already established connections between landowners and partner organizations whenever possible. So that is one of the things that we think about when we're starting to reach out to the landowner. Who is the best person to reach out to this person? Is there somebody who already has a relationship with the landowner? And then if not, we're trying to connect landowners with organizations, either through on-site visits or other forms of communication. Then we move into designing and developing the project, and hopefully we end up implementing projects on the landscape. So we are currently at step 5 and have begun contacting landowners within the Willoughby River watershed through these outreach letters. So this is what it looks like. And when designing our letters, we really wanted to create a visually appealing document that would easily be understood by the landowner. We wanted to connect people. We wanted to connect with people in a way that they didn't need to have a degree in natural resources to understand what we're trying to talk about. And we also wanted to avoid triggering fear and/or anger responses by the landowner by making it clear that we want to work with them. We're not trying to like bulldoze our way in and do these projects. It's solely based on what the landowner wants to do, if that's anything. So zooming in on the first two paragraphs, we wanted to clearly state who we are as a group, including all of our abbreviations, and that's reiterated in the logos at the very top of the page. So this was done to establish credibility for the letter and all of the following project proposals. Then we quickly followed up that paragraph with our reasoning for contacting the landowner. So all of the landowners contacted either share property boundaries with state-owned lands or they're located really close by. So that could help potentially connect state-owned lands or create corridors where it's more protected area. So for each of the letters, maps were created to outline where the landowner's property is in relation to those state lands and other areas of interest. So most of them are mapped out with like the river corridor boundaries outlined. If there's any invasive species known on the property or nearby, that's usually shown on the map. If there's endangered species or species of interest, all that information is usually on the map as well. So as conservation work could be done on the state-owned properties, we wanted to clearly note that we would be interested in chatting with the landowner to do projects on their land as well, just so that our conservation impact could be expanded. So that is those, and then we'll zoom back out, and the following two paragraphs is what I just talked about. So once again, we referenced the attached maps to show the potential projects. So by relating landowner projects to a network of other protected lands, it touches upon how their property fits into the landscape. And it's incredibly important to make sure that you explicitly offer your support, whether it be financial or technical, just letting the landowner know that you're here to help them do any of these projects is key. And then the last part of this first page is this sidebar, which we use to add interesting information and factoids about the water body, just to try to connect people with place, which is one of Northwoods' missions. And we also wanted to help landowners gain an appreciation for what rivers and streams do for us every day. So pastimes such as hunting, fishing, wildlife watching, nature walks, they're all enhanced by having high quality habitats found along these rivers. So showcasing those aspects while relating it to our goals is important. And then on the back side of this page, we have pretty much we're breaking down why it's important to have these stream bank buffers and giving a brief overview of commonly used conservation practices. So just to reiterate what Will was talking about earlier, we really went into detail about like just breaking these down into easy bite-sized, like what are the key benefits of stream bank buffers. So we highlighted that they stabilize stream banks, they control temperatures of rivers and streams both in the summer and the winter. They provide flood mitigation, reduce pollution, and provide organic matter and our important wildlife habitats. And then on the bottom of the page, we go into the different commonly used conservation practices, and we broke them down into the 4 main categories to help landowners understand the overarching goals of each of these different practices. Just giving them a little bit of information, like for stream bank buffer improvements, is to encourage vegetation growth within the riparian zone, whereas habitat improvement enhances the existing stream bank habitat. So just trying to split it out, make it a little bit easier for landowners to read it and understand what we're trying to portray. And then here is one of the example of maps that may be attached to a landowner letter. So using information collected during the 2019 assessments, looking at aerial photographs, LiDAR, and sometimes even like Vermont's BioFinder website, potential projects were created for each potential landowner within our targeted project area. And each landowner will receive a map of their property in relation to state-owned lands, which is highlighted in the green. And potential projects are described in the upper right-hand corner to pretty much just walk the landowner through what is being portrayed on the map itself. And many landowners receive multiple maps of their property to hopefully improve clarity when there's just so many different options available to them. So most maps will include a project areas map, which is the one that I just showed previously, and then a potential conservation areas map, which is what's shown right now. So the first will typically show areas for tree planting, no-mow areas, hydroseeding, invasive control, while the second, which is on the screen now, will generally showcase areas that could be taken out of production or areas to limit development in, just to expand that riparian buffer back from the stream or river. It's important to note that these projects are not set in stone. We're willing to work with the landowner to build a project that not only meets our goals, but to meet their goals as landowners. So as you can imagine, this letter went through very, very extensive review and many edits. So we had multiple stakeholders reviewing the letter. This was followed by having members of Northwood staff who aren't involved in this partnership, but who are well-versed in conveying information to people outside of the environmental field, look it over and give comment. And then essentially we had 5 grand revisions of this letter, with ideas jumping back and forth on how to best approach landowners. We originally thought that we would do letters tailored to each of the different potential project breakdowns. So we would have one specifically for invasive removal, one specifically tailored towards people who are going to potentially have tree planting, a letter for easement or acquisition letters. But we ultimately came back to the idea of having a generalized letter for the first contact. And then following up, it has been a long road to where we are now. We've finished our first round of landowner letters to the Willoughby River, and we're currently waiting to hear back from them now. Many of the landowners that we've sent letters out to own properties up here as second homes, and they might not spend their winters up here. So that might delay when we hear back from them by a little bit. And we also have been working on letters for the Barton River, and we'll eventually move into the Black River watershed. So if we have any landowners interested in conducting projects on their property, we'll schedule to meet with them. We'll send out the most appropriate natural resources partner to talk to them about what could be done on their property and their following steps and all that stuff. So if you guys have any questions, here's all of my contact information. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Jess. That was really interesting. I was going to ask what the landowner response has been like, but it sounds like you haven't had time to hear back yet. It'll be really interesting to hear how this campaign worked. It sounds like, so Stephanie Hurley had a question in the chat. She said, regarding the 8 steps, is there a 9th or 10th step for project maintenance or monitoring post-implementation?
None of that we have discussed yet. I don't know if Pete is on the call, if he has any thoughts on that.
It's a great thought. We're still in the beginning process. I think we have a little ways to go before we have to worry about monitoring projects, but it's certainly something we should and will consider.
And it looks like Ira also had a question. He said, I may have missed it. How was the initial site list generated?
So the initial site list was generated, that was the 2019 assessment of state-owned lands. So like I said, all of our project areas are based around where the state owns property already. So we're just looking to hopefully expand that conservation impact by doing projects on these landowners' lands that are directly bordering or nearby state-owned lands.
Any other questions for Jess? All right, I think we'll move on to our 3rd presentation then. So the last presentation in this session is from Professor Stephanie Hurley with the UVM Department of Plant and Soil Sciences, and she's going to talk about photo visualization of riparian buffers for landowners, farmers, and outreach providers.
Thanks, Allison. Hopefully you can hear me all right. I'm going to share my screen right now. So are you seeing this large format?
We are.
Presentation view. Thank you. Thanks everybody for sticking around. I am really happy to be here. This is a great event. I wasn't able to be here yesterday, but today's been really interesting and informative and giving me tons of additional ideas. So I really appreciate everybody who's led up to this and wrapping up the day. All right, so I have a undergraduate degree in conservation and resource studies, a master's in landscape architecture, and a doctorate in design. And I'm now an associate professor at UVM in the Plant and Soil Science Department and do ecological landscape design at various scales, ranging from more like site design, engineering-esque type work, all the way to social science, so mixing natural science, water quality data with social science, design, surveys, focus groups, so kind of a wide breadth of topics. And this one today is a really fun one to talk about with the group. So I just want to point out that that opening slide was actually fake. So I'll go back to it and presuming you can see it. So we've got a riparian buffer photoshopped out of the original image, which is right here. Oops. So there's a few different words: photo visualization, landscape visualization, photo simulation. I'll probably mostly just say visualization for short, which isn't even that short of a word. And so it's a technique used in landscape design, planning, architecture, and other professions to help people imagine proposed changes in the landscape. They can be an aerial view like I just shared, or more of a human eye, street level perspective view. Usually the software is something like Adobe Photoshop. There are a couple other examples, including the field is moving in the direction of more of like a virtual reality kind of thing. but they're realistic or semi-realistic images to propose alterations of a landscape. And they're often useful to supplement lengthy verbal descriptions of proposed landscape changes. So we ask the question, is a picture worth 1,000 words? And I think some of the research I'll share with you today is showing that the complementary image, words, verbal, audio type of information to go along with images is really helpful to people. And also that this isn't just sort of like a gimmick where you can kind of, imagine anything, but it's a really practical way to get people on the same page, where if I just say riparian buffers, even this extremely educated and knowledgeable crowd on this topic would probably have like a little fluff around the edges of their definitions. Like so-and-so might think about it this way and somebody else think about it this way. And so coming together and saying like, well, here's what I envisioned, and let's just make sure this is what we're both talking about, is really helpful to have the visual cues. And so there's a lot of history around this type of research. The visualizations can complement other forms of communication, and then across languages, across cultures, visualizations have been shown to be accessible for a wide audience, including lay audiences. These are a couple of my own, just sort of showing the variety of, obviously this has nothing to do with, well, not almost nothing to do with riparian buffer. They're more upland, if you will. So you can see them as before and after, existing versus proposed, conveying multiple alternative futures, and possibly conveying trends like, if this such and such routine doesn't change, here's what we'd expect in 10 years, here's what we'd expect in 20 years. Here's another one, you can make them more animated. This is looking at one of my research subjects, which is green stormwater infrastructure. So kind of conversations about how much land area will this change occupy? These can be really helpful for that. Here there's somebody working perhaps in a public street right of way, just like working with landowners along river corridors, like how wide does this buffer need to be? What's this gonna take away from my managed land? And here's a set of existing conditions and a pieced together panoramic. This is near the Charles River in Boston. And the proposal would be to put in a constructed wetland, but maybe this more naturalistic image is not as sort of amenable to people as something that looks a little bit more manicured. So there's ways that you can use these visualizations to convey multiple alternatives. And not just in urban settings. So this is just an example of one of our past projects, hypothetically putting in standing rotating solar panels on a farm. And so other agricultural projects that have also I've been part of in the last few years, looking at ecosystem services. In this case, this is a New Hampshire study and working with stakeholders on their perceptions of different experiences of the landscape. And so you've got here this constant of the blue sky and the red barn silo area, but then quite different contexts. And so how people perceive things is really important. So other types of research use landscape visualizations. I've put in this sort of reddish brown color scheme here, the main areas of my own work and my own publications with my co-authors are the larger font. And I have a list of references at the end, but just sort of explaining how different landscape management practices apply in very different land uses, where conveying things to an audience to understand people's tolerances, aesthetics preferences, impact of lots of people, impact of lots of plants, impact of clear cutting, you name it. There's a lot of use in the visual design and planning worlds for these visuals. So in addition to that paper from New Hampshire, these other two came back in 2019 and 2020 and successfully were published in 2 different journals. They're both led authored by Dr. Rachel Chapman, who's now at University of Maine. Some of you may know her. I definitely know quite a few people on this call. So I will refer to these on the left side, the Society and Natural Resources paper, and on the, which is 2019, and the 2020 paper on the right side, sort of in the next few slides. But the idea of these 2 papers on the left, this was based on focus groups, and it's very possible that somebody actually participated in these focus groups who's in this audience. I was at most of them. I don't think any of the participants are here, but the survey that we did for the paper on the right was with 133 people, and maybe some of you took the survey. So here we go. This is just an example of some of the images we used, and they were not specifically focused, as you can probably tell from the titles, on riparian buffers, but both the focus group and survey did use riparian buffer imagery, which I'll show you in a moment. So there's an existing condition, and here's with a hoop house. This actually also had a mock-up where we included a constructed wetland and drained the field. I'm not going to include that today, but just to give you sort of a sense of the types of modifications people would see as paired imageries, existing versus proposed. So here is the actual one that was used in both the focus group paper and survey paper for a riparian buffer. And so in this existing condition, my impression, having spent a lot of time in the Pacific Northwest and my understanding of buffers being a little different than what I've come to learn in Vermont, is that there is no buffer in this existing image. And so we put in a woody riparian buffer, and you can see there's also these sort of white angled things in the distance and up in the foreground right along the edge of the river, and those are live stakes planted with the intention of growing up and stabilizing the stream bank. So one of the cool things about the focus group is with these images, instead of just saying let's all have a focus group and talk about agricultural BMPs and climate change adaptation, instead we said, well, here are some images, like this is a before and after of a riparian buffer. And people said, well, actually, the fact of that there not being corn here in some cases would count as a buffer. So really getting on the same page with like, okay, well, the research questions are about this buffer, but thank you for clarifying that the definitions are different depending on who you talk to, but what does a buffer mean? So this definition was actually, that conversation I mentioned, same images were in the focus groups, of which we had several in the 20-teens. And this is the image definition we used accompanying, this is all people saw, accompanying the before and after existing proposed riparian buffer images we shared for the survey. And I'll show you some survey data in a moment. So it's maybe not a perfect definition, but we had a mixed audience at a number of different winter farm related conferences. And so we wanted everybody to be on the same page language-wise, but then see that this is what we're talking about, existing versus proposed. From this, and then 3 other BMPs that I'm not speaking about today were in the same study. So the results for the riparian buffer part of the research. So again, I mentioned the different farmer conferences. So there were 6 conferences. They're listed here on the left in the winter of 2015. And of our respondents, they broke out in the category of farmers and homesteaders, 72 individuals, outreach and technical service providers, 28, and then others. And they were pretty informed others. There were some, like a handful of students and faculty, and then other interested people who work for categories we couldn't fit exactly in service providers or farmers. But just have that in mind for the other results coming up too. So this question was about factors limiting riparian buffer implementation. And I think one of the biggest things to know, we have yes, somewhat, and no color-coded, and only 10% of the people we surveyed indicated that the cost of installation was not a factor. Almost everybody said either yes, installation cost is a factor, or somewhat, yes or somewhat in green and gold. And then so you kind of see that go across the x-axis of this image, the cost of maintenance. So yes, you get it, oops, sorry. Cost of maintenance, we get it installed, but then, people were a little less worried about maintenance than installation costs on the whole, but time and labor, and I love seeing all these volunteer opportunities here, because it's clear that you can get help with these things for both installation and maybe maintenance, which was a little bit of a trigger for my question that I just asked on the previous session. Aesthetics for the riparian buffer was not really a concern for most people. Almost 70% were like, aesthetics isn't the problem. And that actually was also true for the other management practices that we asked about in the survey. Aesthetics wasn't registering as a concern. And the need for technical assistance was pretty strong. So that's just a lot of work for this group of people. You don't worry, there's people to talk to, right? We're going to share this knowledge and information and all these great projects that you're all working on. So some more, these papers are quite long, but I went to all the sections that included riparian buffers and I extracted them to share with you today. So in the survey paper, after seeing the visualizations and the text for the 4 different BMPs, we asked various questions. And the first thing that came up that was more like standout for riparian buffers were farmers compared to the other 2 audience members or participants, the technical service providers and the others who took the survey. Were more likely to say they believed riparian buffers would work, that the function of that BMP was strong with farmers. So that means a lot of existing education and outreach has been successful enough to reach this group. Also, we were asking about climate change adaptation through these management practices, and it was quite linked for buffers in particular, that people who answered some earlier questions in the survey indicating like a medium to high level of knowledge and understanding about climate change were more likely to recognize riparian buffers as having utility in adapting to climate change. So compared to the other BMPs we talked about, there wasn't as close of a link as people that had a sort of like a climate sensibility. In the focus groups that were shown the same visualization, they were shown all the practices, or 4 different practices, that before and after kind of pairing I talked about. The riparian buffer images quickly generated a conversation. What I said before about just not mowing or just not planting corn being maybe qualifying as a buffer was one of them, but also having the image as what some of my colleagues call a boundary object, so everyone could connect around this particular image. They started asking, like, well, how long would it take for the trees to grow that much? And how much would that cost? And could I actually graze in there? Could I put tree fruits in there, or trees for fruit harvest, other production uses like haying? Is that possible? Would those trees in particular kind of be an issue for maneuvering equipment on the more managed land? So immediately you get into details because everyone's looking at the same image. And then, so just to remind you, that's the image I was just talking about. And so some more from the focus groups. Immediately people said, you know, if you're doing this more, we want to see options. So we want to see suites of alternative practices. What would it be like with grassy species, with mostly live stakes, with trees and woody vegetation? And for all of those, what are the different widths? Do we want to do 10 feet, 25, 50, et cetera? So they wanted variety. And then they also, just in commenting generally about how to improve photo visualizations and their utility, which I'm of course interested in as a designer and a researcher, picking out the things that were both in general for all of them, and then for the buffer visualization, people really wanted to see examples from their own property or the property that they were working on outreach for. So that's come up over and over, where there's sort of like a threshold in the technology where you can actually, like, yeah, we'll do one for everybody. If they took an hour a piece, you could do that. But if they take, you know, more like 10 hours to construct and make realistic, or if every property needs 3 or 4 different alternatives to be shared, it starts to really add up in terms of the ability to have the technology meet every single person. So originally with this research, we talked about, you know, we don't want to see examples from Iowa. We need a Vermont backdrop. We're not going to show people in Vermont pictures from the Midwest and cornfields there. We're going to show Vermont backdrops. And probably some of you recognize where some of these images were taken as photos. So people then saying, like, even though I recognize this and it's clearly Vermont-y, or it is actually Vermont, I still want to see what it would look like on my own land. Then we have people asking about showing climate change impacts. And an interesting side note on that is so much of the imagery around climate change is overtly negative, you know, showing like downtown Boston in sea level rise conditions, or the Statue of Liberty underwater, or whatever you see. So how to show like both the potential consequences and risks and erosion and degradation associated with climate change, but also positive messages around thinking ahead and adapting. So then different flood stages, different weather conditions, different seasons, aerial images, and not only this sort of street level view, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, all came up. And then the work is still going on. So I'm working on yet another project where the initial results from different focus groups agreed with everything I have on the left here, but also presented some cost analysis and comparison tools. And they really wanted to see both the visuals and the cost tools integrate with each other. They also asked, some of the people wanted species suggestions. So like, show me this, but then give me a species list. Like, how do I go buy these trees? And especially since the Winooski Conservation District is now sold out, I'm seeing in the chat. So people want to know where they get the trees and what the details are about what species. And then in some of the focus groups, we've had the visuals, but not text. And so whenever that's happened, people are like, well, we need some words too. You can't just show me a picture. All right, so just over the last few weeks, I actually was delighted to learn about this thesis that I was not involved with at UVM last year by Mara Braconier, who's on this call too. And this actually does some of the things that were asked for in our focus groups of recent years. So above, you see the Rio photo, but two different conditions, a very flooded Missisquoi River and then a calmer and almost the same location. It's very close. And then below, those are photoshopped, but they're showing the plantings, right? Early juvenile plantings on the side of the river, and then more mature vegetation in the next image. So they're taking the real photo and photoshopping to sort of show change over time, which is definitely something that's been indicated as desirable by our focus group participants. And then nicely, I think, again, in the same thesis, there's a table showing a lot of the same lessons from that study that I just talked about from our own research. So that what I just mentioned about successional images before and after tree planting, showing diversity of species, also aerial perspectives, and this audience particularly mentioned drone technology, which is a little bit different, more bird's eye as opposed to directly straight down the Google map view versus sort of a skewed area. Showing winter ice sheets, that's super important around here, and also sort of the melt and runoff periods. How much land is occupied, which is easier to show often in a plan view, but you can certainly measure in perspective as long as you're clear about whether the measurement is foreground versus background, because the line would change size. It's receding into the distance. This notion of an eroded or carved out bank versus a healthy planted bank, that gets a little bit into some of the comments we've had, like, if we don't do this and there's another Irene, what's going to happen? Or if climate change impacts include these scoured stream banks, what's going to happen? So embed those more directly into the visuals. The cost analysis also came up. So when I came across Meryl's thesis, I was just kind of blown away by how this list matched what we were already doing. And it's just really good to see that there's other folks working on these projects and finding similar things. Value of ecosystem services, I referred to that earlier. And then guide people toward what they should look for and notice. So I think that's really good too. Like, I look at the images, and if you click from one to the next animated, you can pretty quickly see what changed if you go back and forth. However, if you sort of look at them side by side, it's like one of those games in the newspaper that my kids play. We're like trying to find out what's different between this image and that. So why not just like add some text saying, in this image, there's sort of immature vegetation. In this image, there's mature plants, or this would be what it expects after 20 years. And this is after 2 years, which in many cases with trees, after 2 years, you can barely see a difference. So you need to go further out into the future. All right, so let's see. The plan view I mentioned earlier. So this is from, I mentioned a paper by Jennifer Wilhelm. This is not in that paper, but from her dissertation. And this particular study was comparing sort of people's tolerance of increased proportionate agriculture if displacing forest in New Hampshire. And it was related to some goals around New Hampshire producing its own food. And so just to give you a sense, like you can really show planning scenarios at this very zoomed out aerial image level that doesn't relate to people sort of, walking along the street and what they would see, or driving past, but you get a good sense of like proportionate land use from these images. And here's an example. This is not published, but Holly Greenleaf, who's created many of the images I shared today. If folks here know Holly, actually I should mention, I've taught a lot of students how to create these visuals over the years, and Holly just like ran with it. So those first few I showed, what feels like a long time ago, 10 minutes ago or so, were mine. And then many of the agricultural ones were things that Holly created. So side by side, tell you here what to look for. This is a proposal for where to put farm ponds, perhaps for runoff detention. And so on the left side, there's these sort of bare areas, and then on the right side, there's these ponds embedded into the photo with vegetation around them. And then some of the ditches and drainage ways are also buffered, if you will, within the farmland here. So another aerial image. And then the first one that I showed was also originally photoshopped by Holly Greenleaf, creating this before image and after image. It's realistic, you get a sense of the width. The aerial imagery is really helpful for sort of measuring and overlaying with maps that we already have in GIS and other geographic resources. And I just want to briefly mention, and this is another idea that Holly had, if you can't see it in the distance, and I actually don't know if you can see my mouse. I've just been using it this whole time. But there is a river there in the distance at the base of those trees, and one side is vegetated, but here it's almost mown all the way to the riverbank. But the idea here was just this really lush, productive buffer with all these different plants you could harvest for different purposes, ranging from hazelnuts and blueberries and elderberries and pawpaw and all sorts of different things. So, kind of a more extreme example, but the types of productive species that could actually help in a diversified farm operation if productivity in the buffer was a desirable outcome. All right, so I want to acknowledge all these great and wonderful collaborators that I have worked with, and I will share the references as I just mentioned. Yeah, and so I'm gonna just see, there we go. There's my references, and I can unshare and have questions, or I can go back to the images if I need to. Thanks, Allison.
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephanie. I think this is has so much potential for landowner outreach, and I really appreciate you sharing all the details of this research. It's really cool. So we have plenty of time for questions from folks if people have questions. I saw one question already come in from Meg Carter. She said, these are really cool. Are these photo visualizations available for conservation orgs to use for communicating with landowners about implementing effective buffers on their own property?
Well, Allison and I have been talking about this, and Alaire and I have been talking about this a little bit too. So available is sort of like, if you have Photoshop and training, then you can do this. I am now at a point, and Holly Greenleaf, who I kept mentioning, is at a point where you could really get one done a day that looks very realistic, or some pretty rough, sketchy ones in a couple hours. But if your goal is the sort of realism that is present in most of those images, it takes some time. So it's kind of like a time and money question. And I think having them complement other forms of information that can be shared, whether it's for individual landowners on their own property or otherwise, I think the availability is really up to the software purchase and the training and impetus for doing it. But yes.
I'm wondering, but I guess if you have a sense, and you may not, and this would maybe be a further research question, but sort of what the trade-offs are for doing something that's like sketchy and didn't take that long for somebody to put together, maybe, and maybe isn't on the land that is being talked about. Do you think that is an effective tool for sort of bringing landowners along still, or do you think it really needs to be at this level of realism and potentially on their own land?
Yeah, well, so the part about does it have to be on my own land or the project site, I think there's a lot in those papers I talked about, the focus groups and surveys. On the whole, people said, these visualizations help me better understand the practice. Like the majority of people would rather have had them than not. So that was just true. And then also said they aid in my understanding of why, for example, you're saying this is a BMP for climate adaptation. Like the visual helps me understand that. And they're the pretty realistic ones. The more sketchy question, more about like scale, I think some of the visuals I've seen today where it's a map view and there's a band of like, here's where we plant trees, are actually adequate for the question of a landowner being asked how much of their land are they giving up. You can measure it, there's a scale on the map, there's these polygons carved out. But if people want a sense of how it feels on the street view perspective, it helps to at least show relative to like a person's height or something that feels a little more familiar. And you can plop these on a perspective photo. A photo is in perspective already when you take it. So you can kind of, you know, add trees on here and there, and they'll either look like they fit right in perspective or they don't. So there's some sort of course level things that can be done pretty quickly and I think are worth it. I think that as a communication tool where you're making sure everybody's on the same page, if you just say, here's a paragraph about riparian buffers and a photo of one that we installed without a little bit more about sort of the scale and scope, it's hard for people to know. Does the landowner understand what I mean? You know, are we definitely on the same page? But yeah, I think more visuals are always helpful. I see the chat. Go ahead and ask me which.
Yeah, so the next question is from Ira. He says, for the visualization process, do you keep a library of assets? Also, are there best practices for creating these visualizations? How involved is the training?
Those are all awesome questions. I have a library of backdrop photos. A lot of them are from summer, and I'm realizing that it's just nice to look at pictures of the summer. The sun's out now, but it hasn't been. So the winter images are going to be harder to go to my existing library to make, but that is a natural next step, is creating these more, you know, the deciduous trees have no leaves on them. It's very, the water level's rising or it's covered in ice or whatever. Like those, I don't have the background library, but I do have pre-cut out tree species and shrub species, so I can use them again and again. So once you literally trace in Photoshop around the texture of these things. And you can do more of like a lollipop tree that's just sort of like messy, or you can like cut around each leaf with this tool. But once you've done it, and I've got some awesome maple tree, I'm just gonna stamp that thing out on over and over and use it for project after project. So yeah, and then the training, I think, doesn't exist yet. We've been talking about, I train my students, but I haven't since the pandemic. And that's because there is an inevitable part of like leaning over your keyboard and showing you something that I haven't figured out how to do remotely without losing my mind. But I'm hoping that we can get some training sessions going in the next year at some point when it feels safe. And I think like, you know, a couple of half days in a row would be adequate to get people started.
Yeah, I mean, I can see this being, yeah, for people on the call, Stephanie and I have been talking about when it makes sense maybe to do those trainings when we can do things back in person again. And I think that could be really fun. So stay tuned for that. And I could see even, you know, for projects where this takes several hours or a day or multiple days to get something together, if you have a really critical piece of land that you think is going to be important to restore for a lot of reasons and you really want to invest some in outreach to those landowners, I could see this being really, really valuable for those projects in particular.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions for Stephanie before we wrap up? All right, well, thank you, Stephanie, so much for, oh, there's one more. Alaire said, once you start training again, would you want actual properties to use as examples?
Sure. I mean, everyone could come to a training with a free 30-day trial of Photoshop on their computer and backdrop photos. You know, some things to look for just on the, it could be that we're not all working on the same photo is what I'm saying. Hi, Kate Longfield. The comment I made about summer images, there's more to unpack there, but like if you have too many shadows or not enough, no shadows, like a real gray day, both of those can be beneficial. You just kind of have to go with one or the other. Like you don't want to fake, you don't want to put like a bright sunny gold hewn tree with a big shadow on it on a day that looks like, you know, it's a gray November in Vermont. So yeah, that kind of thing you can look out for. But having some backdrops to choose from, good perspective views that aren't looking down or up too much also, so that things seem eye level. Yeah, thank you. And this was just really awesome. What a great event.